So before we get started, I wanted to announce that this is officially season 2 of the podcast. And as it is season 2, I am upping the stakes and doing a whole bunch of different stuff. So right now, literally, if you're listening to this, you can do this right now. You can go watch the podcast over on YouTube. And if you're watching me on YouTube, hello. If you're wondering where more episodes of the podcast are other than the 4 that should be on YouTube as of me recording this, you can subscribe to the podcast itself. I'll always have a link to the actual audio feed in the description of every video going forward. I'll have links to the YouTube feed on the audio feed, so you can find whatever you want, wherever you want. But I want to go into a little bit of why I'm doing this the way I'm doing this, because, fun fact, I'm not actually great on camera. Not for the reasons you think, not because I think I'm ugly or any of that nonsense, but because when I'm doing these podcasts, I actually look at a lot of different things. Like, I'm staring right now at a page about the thing that we're going to talk about this episode. And so I'm never really looking at one place for very long. I'm never really looking at a camera, and I didn't want to do the disservice of doing a YouTube thing without being able to give the YouTube audience like a good YouTube presentation, which is why I'm actually doing a kind of VTuber thing here. And so a couple things about these videos is the videos you've seen up until this one, and including this one, and kind of including all of them for a little while, will be kind of experimental in terms of the, not necessarily the format, but the visuals and stuff like that. Everything is movable, everything is changeable, and I will be messing with things to, improve things, make things more interesting, make things more of what I think they should be. So give it a chance, and I hope you like it. But and that actually includes the background you're seeing right now, the avatar you're seeing right now. In previous recordings, you'll see I have a kind of like rope around my avatar that I removed because I just didn't like the way it looked. I'll probably be swapping the avatar that does all of my lovely AI assistant's plot synopsises out for another avatar that I actually designed and made. I've designed and made all 3 of them, but this one I like more for kind of the purposes that I'll be using it for, along with just liking it more in general. But welcome to season 2. This is a big deal for me and the whole deal. So, and I hope you. So if you like the show, but you've always wanted to watch it on YouTube, or you want a YouTube way to interact with the show, that's available now. If you're seeing this and you don't know what the show is, I encourage you to go listen to previous episodes. New episodes from here on out will show up here, and you'll see the format and all that other stuff. I'm also doing this to avoid like the copyrightness of YouTube, since I've put up YouTube videos in the past on this channel, but a fair amount of them got copyright struck, even though I took out the audio and it was all commentary and all that stuff. They still got struck, and I actually won a fair amount of those disputes. Like, I disputed the first couple, and they were like, nope, he claimed fair use. He's doing commentary over clips and publicly available clips. But after a while, it just got pretty monotonous to just go on to YouTube and realize, like, oh, this thing got struck down, so I had to go deal with it, and blah, 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 blah. So this was kind of my creative way of doing that, still being able to give you some visuals of the show. I'm probably going to leave the TV screen behind me blue for the time being for this opening, just so you can see where visuals will go in the future. And for iSynopsis, you'll see this soon. She has her own environment that's got a place for the trailers to play, so it'll all feel much more polished, and we'll get some visuals for this podcast about a largely visual medium of anime, which is another huge reason why I'm doing this way. So I hope you like it. If you are listening and you haven't checked it out, go check out the podcast on the YouTube page. I hope that I'm doing a really good job at this. So, like I said, it's all movable. It's all going to be new for me and for you, and I'll be changing stuff kind of on the fly oftentimes to suit more of what I think it should be. This is all what you're seeing right now is already a lot of decisions and you'll see previous backgrounds in certain recordings and stuff. A lot of decisions have already gone into this, and a lot of decisions will already go into it. We'll go into it in the future, rather. But, so bear with me a little bit. I'll try and keep the quality of the show up, but this is a whole new thing. So, without further ado, let's jump into the show that I'm wanted to talk about this week. And that's a little show from last season that actually you might not have seen. I talked about it in my favorite things podcast, which I think I republished on the Bento Box feed, on the Bento Radio feed. But this is a show called Magilumiere Magical Girls Inc. So take it away.
Girls aren't chosen by destiny. They're hired professionals. Society has industrialized and commercialized the role of magical girls to combat mysterious entities called phantoms, which manifest from negative emotions. Kana Sakuragi, a fresh out of college job seeker, stumbles upon an active phantom attack while interviewing for a position and ends up helping to defeat it alongside a pro-magical girl from a private company called Magilumiere Co. Limited. Impressed by her instincts and potential, the company offers Kana a job. With no better prospects, she joins up. From there, the series follows Kana as she trains, bonds with her eccentric colleagues, especially her confident and skilled partner, Koshigaya, and faces both monster battles and corporate headaches. The story cleverly blends magical girl tropes with satirical and thoughtful takes on office culture, including aspects such as workplace hierarchy, stress management, and the logistics of fighting monsters on a schedule.
Now, this is one of my favorite things from the 2024 year-long season of anime. I think it was in winter 2024, actually. But it went largely kind of untalked about, at least when I was watching it, for a couple different reasons. First off, it is definitely a otaku core show. It's not a show that's for general audiences, and that makes a lot of sense why general audiences wouldn't be as taken with it. But in actuality, I think it has a lot to offer anybody who's watching it, especially young adults and people who are just starting their first job. I think I might publish a article that I wrote on Spec, but didn't end up getting published, all about, anime in the work, like anime as a way to learn how to be in the workplace, because this kind of show is an overlapping of a bunch of different kind of iyashikei moments of genres in anime. And the other reason why it didn't probably get on lots of people's radar is the place it was streamed. So for a while now, there's been this issue and fracturing with streaming, but one of the places where that started the most is with Amazon Prime Video. So if you subscribe to Amazon Prime, you get access to their Prime Video platform, which has had some hit shows. I think Translucent was their first big breakout award-winning show. But one of the things that they did when they, put this streaming platform to potential licensees is that they decided that you can do whatever you want on this platform. You can include stuff on the platform, and it can just be included with Prime with the subscription, which is a tack-on thing from Amazon, from the Amazon Prime shipping subscription, 2-day shipping subscription, or it used to be 2 days when the world was still sane. But you can also say, hey, we want this to be available to stream on the platform, but we want people to pay, a rental fee, or we want people to buy it through this platform. And so it's this big jumble of stuff. And what that freedom of how you present and how you host your content on the platform allows people a kind of, and companies that own all the IP that we watch, an opportunity to really do what they want instead of just giving something wholesale to, say, Netflix or Hulu or even Crunchyroll in this case, or High Dive. You can give something to Amazon and you can still make money off it. It's not just the licensing fee that Amazon pays, although you can also do it that way. They'll kind of take all comers, if that makes any sense. And as a result, that gave them a lot of flexibility in the licensing market for anime. And what that looked like is eventually they were able to do something very strange. And that very strange thing was they licensed the programming block. And I don't know if they still do this, but for a long time, they licensed. Well, at first they had some high-profile shows, and then they had an extra tack-on subscription called Anime Strike, where they kind of bottlenecked everything in there, and you could get most of the anime stuff through like an extra $5 thing. They canceled that, and then they turned around and they licensed the whole programming block, and they licensed the kind of infamous programming block for like the programming block that brings you things like Paradise Kiss, that brought you things like Honey and Clover, these really avant-garde, much more mature, prestige anime projects from the Noitamina block. And I believe the Noitamina block still exists. And so in doing that, they did two things. They guaranteed themselves some of the best shows of every season because they would be these thoughtful, less restrictive shows, but they also gave themselves an in for like, this is where you put thoughtful, more interesting, introspective stuff. Eventually that culminates with things like they had Recreators on there for a while. I don't think it's on there anymore, but I could be wrong. They were the first run of Vinland Saga, and then they were also the first run for really interesting projects like Magilumiere. And the reason why I'm telling you all this is because, once again, this is a very otaku core show, and what I mean by that is it's dealing with a lot of things that are pervasive in anime culture. A couple of years ago, there was actually, I think a season or two before Magilumiere, there was a show called Gushing Over Magical Girls. And ever since Madoka Magica, there's been this kind of reconsidering of the magical girl genre. And even really before Madoka Magica, that's just one of the more famous ones. And that reconsidering of the genre turns opened up the field for what the genre could do, what it could look like. You have things like there was a season of Pretty Cure recently where like all the Pretty Cure characters were adults and they like could still transform, and they, from what I understand, they dealt with the fact that like the magical girls grew up in fiction, and that was really interesting. You had a show called Magical Girls Spec Ops something that was like a super hardcore, super edgy. It was very bad. I watched most of it. Probably watched all of it and don't remember, but that's how kind of it was. But it was this idea of magical girls who had already saved the world once and were now not mercenaries isn't right, but they were like they were used almost as like a as an army reserve scenario, and they would be the ones, and like the government would be like, hey, you need to go deal with this terrorist threat. And like all of them have PSD, all of them are really messed up, but they're all messed up from when they did this, from when they were in like 6th grade. And now they're like college age or teenagers or something like that, and they've like these like really disaffected, disillusioned like teenagers who still are magical girls, but it sucks. Which was kind of the thing that took me all the way through that show. It's just like, this is really interesting. Are they doing anything with it? No, but it's interesting. And the reason why I'm telling you all this is because I think that Magilumiere takes that idea of deconstructing and messing with the magical girl genre and does something really interesting with it. And that is that they professionalize the entire concept. The magical girls are no longer chosen by fate. It's a job you can have. It's a coveted job. In the show, it's like a coveted thing that people want to do, and magical girls like have a really high salary because essentially they're ghostbusters, for lack of a better term. But it's a job. Like you can just kind of, magic is relegated to software on tablets, and like you use magic with a little like fancy, was basically a little toy wand that's like internet connected and connected back to a tablet that somebody's operating, or connected all the way back to your offices where somebody's operating it. And with the exception of a couple characters, the show kind of dispenses with like, oh yeah, no, like they're not like nobody here is strictly magical. They're mostly, it's mostly an office job in a way that's pretty interesting and thoughtful, and it's a lot less about the like magical girlness of it and more about we're essentially like high-end weird exterminators in a way that doesn't occur to a lot of people. And so it ends up being this really interesting take on a genre that has existed for long enough where you can start to have these takes and it's not completely and totally off base. In this world, there are 500 magical girl agencies, ranging from like a 5-person small office to like the biggest building in Akihabara has a tree growing out of it, A, and B is the biggest magical girl company in Japan. And they don't focus on anything out of Japan, but I don't really think it needs it. Everything's very clearly defined, and it gives you the feeling that, like, yes, stuff could be happening outside of Japan, but we don't need to have that conversation right now. But it doesn't. The concept doesn't wear itself thin because they do such a good job of making it like a slice of life workplace show that, in the same way that something like, and this is a show that joins a large contingent of other workplace shows like Shirobako, like New Game, like a bunch of other shows, even something like Remake Our Life. And what ends up happening is you get this show that is really functionally about having your first job and succeeding in your first job in a way that's pretty natural, but also shows the main character as the main character Kana as a pretty gifted employee. And one of the really interesting things as somebody who's applied to a lot of jobs in my life is actually that the first episode is very much about job hunting. And it's very much about the way that the job hunting process, particularly in Japan, but you can probably apply this to anyone in the world at this point, has become this like soulless suck of a vacuum that produces not great results anymore. Because when people are like interviewing Kana and they do the typical Japanese interview thing of like, she goes into a room and she sits in front of this panel full of people in a singular chair and answers questions and does her best. Only it doesn't, at no point does it feel like it's built for her to succeed. And that's made really clear in the very first episode when she's helping her future coworker in a woman named Hitomi in a attempt to exterminate Callie, and Callie is this universe's name for the monsters that show up, who are, for all intents and purposes, like a pest. They're dangerous and they can cause huge problems and they can hurt and kill people, but the entire universe of the show treats it like a cross between Ghostbusters and Exterminators, and down to even the like ghost busting trap thing that they do with their wands. But Hitomi notices immediately, like, holy shit, you're really good at this. You have this control over this incredibly clunky, crappy software that we have to use that isn't common. That isn't like a thing that most people are capable of doing at any level. And the thing that kind of reveals is that she's gotten really good at learning new skills because she's been trying to tailor herself, as you do as a job seeker, to all of these different jobs that you end up like applying for. So you try and tailor your resume, you try and tailor your skills, you try and learn new things. I've done this. Lots of creatives have done this. It's not uncommon. It wasn't uncommon when I was a freelance creative to hear from a crew like, "Oh, you'll be fine. Like, oh, this software is really similar to this other software that you use. It'll be fine." And usually they were right. Or they'll say, "Take a look at this. This is what this job requires, and get your head around it, and you'll be fine." also always happened. But what also happens constantly is you learn things for what ends up to be or feels like in the moment no reason. Either out of curiosity or like you wanted a job that you didn't end up getting. And so this scene proves that like the industry, like the not even the industry of like magical girls, but like the world of employment doesn't know what to do with this young woman who has extraordinary technical ability, but the system doesn't have any way for her to properly display that technical ability because she's not applying to jobs that are ostensibly creative jobs. If you're in the creative industries, you know that when you show up to a job, you show up with two things. You show up with your resume, no more than one page, and your portfolio. And the portfolio proves that you know how to produce the work that they might ask you to produce. In the case of a creative job, I have walked out on jobs because they wanted to give me like a Photoshop test or like aptitude tests on software. And to me, what that says is the people hiring don't know what they're doing. Because anybody who knows what they're doing would know, like, oh, he uses Photoshop or some other creative software, take your pick, very differently than we would, than a different creative would. So trying to quantify it with like a written test isn't the right way to evaluate their skill. The way to evaluate skill is in the portfolio. But in non-creative jobs, that kind of creative problem solving can only be spoken to. It can't really be demonstrated other than like this is how you've like we want to see specifically how you problem solve. They've got all of these tests, and when they do implement that stuff, it becomes kind of rote. They've got all these tests for coders now that like you have to pass these like logic tests in order to even be considered for a job. And what it's become is less of like you're honestly thinking through it and giving honest answers, and more you're spending tons of time on these websites that collate the correct answers and you're memorizing them. It's a continuation of like the public school or even like grade school or even college paradigm of the value isn't in learning, it's in memorization. And what you see in Kana in the very first episode of the show is she's someone who has learned things in a deep and meaningful way. And she's someone who reads into things and remembers them. Later on in the show, she gets a new broom because they have a equivalent of brooms in this universe that are basically little rockets they ride around on that happen to look like brooms, although just barely. But she gets a new one, and the person who designs the broom for Magilumiere is actually the name of the company for their company, is this like genius broom designer who just doesn't make things very complicated, because up until now he told me was the only magical girl that the company had on staff, so she had no one else to tailor stuff to, and she ends up making such a complex and like meaningfully different broom for Kana, and then just like dumps a manual in front of her and says, your boss said you were really good with this crap. Here's the stuff so you can figure it out. And she does, and from then on in the series, you see her use this really unique piece of equipment that was made because they knew she could handle it. And the whole show also does that and sings kind of praises without being too sycophantic. It never feels... Kana's strong points are not the only strong points of the only character in the show. She's still pretty hesitant. She's still pretty unsure. She doesn't have the same kind of dive headlong into it that a lot of other magical girls that she meets do. And that's purely because of experience. A lot of... The thing that the show really gets right about working your first real adult job is that it's a really hard thing. You can be as talented as you want, but nothing will make up for a level of experience and a level of time spent on any job. That could be, a job stocking grocery shelves, or a job, running a Fortune 500 company. In either case, the longer you spend doing it, the more experience you get. And the longer you spend doing it, the more different kinds of experience you get. You start to notice things. So, once you've been doing the job of stocking storeroom shelves for long enough, you just know where everything is. You stop needing to ask those questions of oh, hey, you just said they need more milk in the milk aisle. What is that aisle again? You just know that. It's not this... And that's kind of learned memorization comes with just putting your feet in the same footsteps over and over and over again. It's not even monotonous. It's just memorization and learning through doing. And this show really celebrates that. It also celebrates creative and thoughtful problem solving. And its characters are also pretty bizarre and interesting. The boss character, I forget his name, but the head of the magical girl firm that Kana joins is actually a a cross-dressing magical girl cosplayer who is dead serious. It's so funny. And the reason it's so funny is because there's this understanding that at some point in the magical girl mythos of the show, that magical girls were an otaku thing still, and they still are in certain ways. But with the professionalization of them, it became less of a thing that just you could be a fan of, because now you could go work and you could support magical girls directly in a way that you can't you couldn't in the past. So lots of people who just loved magical girls ended up becoming CEOs of companies, and they hint at that later on in the show with a not an antagonist character, but a character with an opposing view to a character who actually runs the biggest magical girl agency in Akihabara. And they make it pretty clear that the show is very interested in showing that difference in a way that isn't that any show of this ilk could do, but this show takes care to do it really well. And showing the difference between somebody who's like doing this because they love it and somebody who's doing it because it's a good and doing it because it's good business, or somebody who started doing it because they loved it and has only continued doing it because it's good business. And their boss, a guy named Shugimoto, is this like big guy who has grown his hair out to like the extreme, and he walks around in a magical girl maid outfit, essentially. And he has this real love of not just the work, but the entire mythos of magical girls. And that extends to everybody to the last character who's like a main cast member, who is a character by the name of Nikoyama. And Nikoyama is the firm's program. Actually, there's two more characters. Nikoyama is the firm's programmer, and he's really shy, but he really loves designing magical girl magic, because in this universe, that's a thing that's designed specifically by software designers. And over time, he comes out of his shell, but he starts pretty like introverted and unconfident in himself. And Shugimoto, who's kind of the show's like dad, for lack of a better term, said like he's a one of a kind magical designer, but he just needs like someone who can push him enough where he can see it for himself, and Kana ends up being a large part of the answer to that. And eventually Shugimoto as a really exceptional boss, because these kind of like workplace Iyashike shows, like this, like Shirobako, actually Shirobako the least so, which I find really interesting, like what's called like New Game, are these shows that are what I like to think of as competence workplace, for lack of a better term, competence workplace porn. And what I mean by that is not that they're lurid or anything, but that they display this level of competence in the workplace where everybody's doing their best. And I'm not saying that everybody doesn't always do their best, although sometimes people just have bad days, where everybody's doing their best and everybody's working very competently to accomplish a single goal. And that can feel really cathartic for people who don't get that in their workplace. And that's part of the reason why I described these shows like these like workplace shows as Iyashike like, because they really are on some level. And largely, unless the shows are trying to have commentary about it, like something like the animation episode of Paranoia Agent, or something like the animation episode of Paranoia Agent is perfect, or the opening actually of Zom 100, where the main character is working at a black company that is so sclerotic and like bad that like it's just bad. If you haven't seen the first episode of that show, I encourage you to go find it, because it's definitely worth watching, if for no other reason than it's a really interesting display of like, this is how bad a workplace can get. And that's very different from this show. So what Sugimoto ends up doing with Kana now in the mix, now that he has kind of enough playing pieces to attempt it, is he kind of gives Kana permission to spread her wings finally, in a way that you, as a viewer at that point, feel really excellent about, because you see this character who is described and shown to be really competent. Like, not even competent, but truly talented just at creative problem solving in a workplace. And you get the clear sense that it's not just as a magical girl. It would be true if it was in like a random office somewhere too. And the results are, she's constantly on the phone with Nikoyama and and Hitomi, and they're like developing new magic on the fly. And eventually they develop this particular kind of magic that solves a problem that is a really difficult solve. And that magic, like that incident goes more than a little viral in the kind of magical girl industry, and they go to like a magical girl industry convention, which felt really eerily like the conventions I go to for work, but for my day job. But what ends up happening is everybody's like, "Hey, can we get that magic? Can you like send us over the specs for that? Because that was really good and interesting." And Sugimoto fully like gives Kana credit, like, "You did a good thing here." But that's just the like one level of it. The level of it that they didn't get into much, but they do touch, is kind of not just the kind of happy-go-luckiness of this small agency, but that agency interacting with other agencies, and in kind of true corporate lifestyle mode, other agencies do other things. Like, you meet a character who is significantly older than the rest of the cast, because the rest of the, if I had to age out the like magical girls we've seen until now, that I mentioned until now, Hitomi is probably 25. I think she's literally listed at 25. Kana is like 22 to 24. I would probably put her in the 24 range. In true anime style, the quote unquote older character is straight up like 36, or she's like my age or something, which is wild still. But it's this woman named Lily, and the reason why I say woman instead of magical girl is because the entire show describes her as not a magical girl, but like a specific magical woman. And the show, it tells you in that moment, like, we recognize that people do this for a long enough time, where they're no longer like late teens, early 20s, quote unquote kids. They're doing this as adults too. So the term becomes magical woman. And she tells Kana, like, "I'm not considered a magical girl, I'm considered a magical woman." And her agency is an offshoot of a cosmetic brand. So she is like a cosmetic model and basically, once again, a magical Ghostbuster. And the show does really interesting things with her. It introduces a fourth magical girl by the name of Mai, who works for the big evil corporation. And that really rounds out like the magical girls that they give you in this 12-episode thing, where they show you kind of the whole of this fantastical industry and kind of what it all looks like. But it's all such a really neat and like tightly constructed package, with a lot of places still yet to go. I just noticed when I was looking up the character list on my anime list that there's actually a manga. I wasn't aware that there was actually, I think I was aware that there was a manga, but I forgot. So there is more to this to go. Much like I was disappointed that something like Vinland Saga was kind of contained to to Amazon Prime. I am really kind of, it's unfortunate that this show was contained to Amazon Prime for its premiere, when it premiered its first season. I hope it gets to go wider, because I think that a lot of people would really like this show, because it is really interesting. It's really interesting things to say about working in an industry, different approaches to working in that same industry from other angles, and just working in general. So many of these shows, of these like professionalized shows, I don't want to say handicap themselves, but create a box for themselves by taking things that are, yes, very specific otaku industries, like anime, like video game design, Shirobako and New Game specifically, and showing you kind of competence porn, as I described it earlier, of the possibilities in those industries. Like if you watch something like New Game, which I love, I own it on Blu-ray, you're not going to see any part of New Game where it feels like the characters are being crunched. Alba, the main character of New Game, does struggle with things, and it can be difficult, but it's not like everything is always okay in the end. And it's so focused on that industry that it doesn't widen ever. These shows can have a kind of Pokemon effect. And what I mean by that is, when you're watching New Game, everything in New Game is about game design. It becomes this like contained bubble. There's nothing outside of like game design, like even like art is done in context of game design, music, all that stuff, but it feels weird to do that, but then not feature any negative consequences of working in those industries, because it feels almost like you're making an infomercial for the industry. Like I said earlier, Shirobako, of even the three of Magilumiere, which is an industry that doesn't exist, and we'll get to why I think it escapes this problem in a second, but Magilumiere, New Game, and Shirobako, of the three, Shirobako does this the least. It does the kind of rose-colored glasses the least, and I think that has an awful lot to do with the fact that it is an anime about the production of anime, and it wants to be much more like, New Game feels much more like an advertisement for come work in the video game industry. It's so fun. Don't think about crunch. Don't think about the fact that you might not be paid enough. Don't think about any of that stuff. Just think about doing the work. And in Magilumiere, it escapes that in two very key ways. The first way it escapes it is pretty important. It shows you up front that Kana is not being sought after for her skills very well by an industry that she's not just interviewing for magical girl jobs, if I remember correctly. She's interviewing for jobs, period. and nobody wants her. But as soon as you, the viewer, are shown, like, oh, she has real skills, she has a genuine talent for learning and adapting and creative problem solving, you realize, oh, no one's actually interested in figuring out whether or not she is, worth, even taking as an employee. Because they're clearly missing all this stuff. And it's just, so by doing that, the show establishes that, hey, this is not going to be like a lovey-dovey thing. She will screw up sometimes. It won't always be perfect. But she's going to put her all into whatever she does, and that all will make her more successful than not. And there are moments in the show where, like, the character I mentioned earlier, they end an episode brutally on Lily, and you assume that she dies because Kana just didn't have enough experience to deal with the scenario. It ends up being okay, but she learns from the encounter, and it changes her and her approaches in a way that it wouldn't have. And just by doing that, just by introducing just a little bit of friction, you still get this, like, competence porn, as I keep bringing up, but you get a kind of sense of reality that something like New Game doesn't have, as I've said before. I'm not saying that New Game is bad for not having that, but I am saying that there's a rose glasses scenario happening in New Game that it clearly compensates for with an incredible amount of charm and just kind of like cutesy, almost KyoAni-esque humor. I don't think it was done by KyoAni, but it's just, the whole show is pretty interesting in terms of what it has to say about working and creative problem solving on the job and like a professional life and balance. And what's his face, the Sugimoto, their boss, is pretty, like, part of the reason why he brings on Kana in the first place was because Hitomi was doing too much. Like, he's like, I want to make sure I don't tire anybody out. So we wanted to hire a new person because Hitomi can only do so much without getting burnt out. And I don't want to do that to anybody. And like I said, these shows are built to be kind of competence porn. But in doing that, Sugimoto isn't just being competent, he's being a good boss. And so much of what these work-based Yasuke shows are glossing over when they give you the rose-tinted glasses of something like what's it called, New Game, or even the more realistic portrayal of the anime industry in Shirobako is this idea that, like, is your project manager very good? Is your boss making sure that, like, you take a whole hour for lunch? And that sounds stupid, but if you've ever not done that for enough times in a row, you notice it by the end of the week. Your work is less precise because the environment didn't make it clear that, like, hey, maybe you should take care of yourself in the process of working. And something that it's very easy as a creative in any industry, but especially in the creative industries, to forget is that if you burn out and you, like, burn out hard for multiple years, no one will be able to use that skill you have. You won't be able to put that skill to use for anybody because you'll be so incredibly like singed to a crisp that you won't be useful. You won't be capable of the things that you are at your best because you won't be at your best. You'll be this kind of like broken toy for a long while. So a lot of what you should think about when you're thinking about like creative work and like a creative professional life is, am I pushing too hard? Because if I push too hard, I'll burn out, and I'm saying this on YouTube and in podcast land, and that's like those are two big burnout zones. But if you burn yourself out, you're not useful to anybody. So a degree of self-care is important in a way that, like, just because of the way working has come to work and because of the way industries have come to use creative workers, is not often enough offered up as like, oh, hey, you should take your full hour for lunch. One of the better bosses I ever had was working for a large department store. I can say Macy's because I can't show you the work I did, but working for Macy's, I had a boss who actually kicked me out of the office when I came back, not knowingly because I have no sense of time. After taking a 15-minute lunch break instead of taking an hour-long lunch break. And she looked at me and she's like, get out of here. Take your hour. I don't care if it takes you like 15 minutes to eat. Take your hour. And to like make me feel better about it, she said at the time, like, I'll get in trouble if you don't. But also, like, you need that hour. You need some form of decompression when you're doing anything for a long length of time, because you dull over time. If you think of yourself as a sharp knife, you will dull over time the more you use that edge. So you need to take time to like basically resharpen or like decompress, and you'll find yourself a better, not even employee, but better at doing what you do at the level that you want to do it. Because yes, there are bullshit jobs, and yes, there are crappy jobs, but what I think is pretty clear is oftentimes you want to do things with a certain level of skill, if for no other reason than you don't want to do them again. And if you're like strung out and tired and you've been at it for too long, that makes it really hard. And a lot of the kind of confidence on display in the show is immediately contrasted against particularly the character I brought up earlier, Mai, who works for the big, like, giant magical girl corporation. Mai pretty quickly sees, like, oh, this is what it looks like when, I don't have to, when magical girls aren't made to be a machine, aren't made to be aren't made to be like this, the customer is always right, execute efficiently and never stop, kind of, when there's humanity allowed in a job environment. And when humanity is not allowed in a job environment, or when humanity is punished, or opinions or participation out of line is punished in a job environment, you get an environment that feels much more like I forget the name of the bigger magical girl agency, but the large magical girl agency in the show. And it's pretty quickly demonstrated by, like, I think the middle of the show that, like, part of the reason that Shugimoto is running a much smaller agency like he is, instead of being like a bigwig, super successful, like head of a giant company, like his peers are, is that he doesn't want to engage in that kind of like in the kind of corporate bureaucratic nonsense that we open the show with, that the whole first season of this show opens with. I hope it gets another season. But that doesn't interest him, because to him that represents a thing that is not going to lead to good things. That is going to take people as grist for the mill and spit them out when it's done, instead of creating capable, talented employees, people are capable of doing like not just good work, but truly excellent work. And yes, along the way you may get people who are really talented and they have the fortitude to stand up to that kind of bureaucratic nonsense. But part of Sugimoto's point is you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have to press yourself in that way. And I think it's really interesting to present this kind of vision of not making the biggest thing you can so you can make a much more responsible thing, especially in the context of, Japanese work culture and their kind of like corporate work yourself into an early grave culture, which they've done a lot of things in Japan to curb. Like, I know at certain massive firms, like maybe even Dentsu, they basically force you to go home on the weekends now. But like it's been a public secret for years that like, yes, you get awesome amounts of vacation days, but also you just shouldn't take them. I'm gonna tell a story about my friend Kie. Hi, Kie, if you're watching this. But Kie is very different from a lot of other people who work in Japan, because she spent over a decade working in America. So she is not afraid to just jump ship for a better paycheck. She's done it a couple times. And it's not a disloyal thing. It's a consideration of, well, they want to pay me more than the other people want to pay me. I would be an idiot not to take this. There's nothing personal there. And it shouldn't be personal. There's also no dishonor in, like, taking the better paycheck. And in a culture where largely people stay in their jobs for decades, for their entire lives, where lifetime employment was a thing for a very long time across Japan. It's now less of a thing by a lot, from what I understand. But in that kind of culture, you kind of dance with the one who brought you until the end of the ball. And Sugimoto, in making a company like Magilumiere, the thing the show's named after, has created something that functions more responsibly, as thinking about the big picture of what's going to happen next and what's the best thing for not just the public, not just the bottom line, but the public and the people doing the work, aka in his case Hitomi and Kana, and the third medical girl who I missed, who goes and interns with them for a while. But the whole show is really interesting. And like I keep saying, it's very otaku coded. It's, rooted in the concepts of like magical girls The whole thing is set in and around Akihabara, for heaven's sake. The whole programming angle of it gets very technical, and they throw a lot of mumbo jumbo at you, but it doesn't feel quite so heavy in the practice of it. At least it didn't feel heavy to me. And I watched this thing subtitled, so that's how you know it was like, I could take it, you can take it. But it's really interesting. It's a really interesting, like, one of those when it comes to, kind of, like I said, kind of Iyashike workplace competency porn shows. So it's available still on Amazon Prime Video. I don't know if it's going to go anywhere else, but you should definitely go check it out. I'll put a link to the My Anime page in the description of the YouTube video, and in the description of the YouTube video, so you can go at least read it. And if you read this full synopsis, although I present a synopsis at the beginning of this, but if you want to read more about it, you can go to the My Anime List page and check it out. But on that note, thank you for joining me for the first part of season 2. And I am looking forward to doing this a lot more, because it will be it's just a fun thing to do this way. And if you like the show, be sure to subscribe to it as a podcast. Be sure to all that stuff, but I'm going to probably put that in at the end of the recording anyway. So without further ado, thanks everybody.